Good afternoon. This is Fighting Fascism in a Post-War World. I'm Gemma Birnbaum, the Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society. And I am so pleased to have with me two panelists. First is Dr. Matthew Dallek. He's a historian and professor at George Washington University. His most recent book, which you maybe saw out in the lobby there, is Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. And with us as well is Kenneth Jacobson, National Deputy Director of the ADL, and ADL's longest serving employee, having joined the organization in 1971. So Matt and Kenneth, thank you so much for joining us today. We're gonna jump right into it. Often the narrative around post-war society is that it's peaceful, it's prosperous, everything's fine now. What are some of the challenges that the Allies faced in the immediate aftermath, both at home and abroad? And Matt, if you could answer that for us.
Well, it's great to be here, and I should add that for my book, the papers here in your collection of the 24 archives I consulted were probably the single best resource. They're really amazing, and so it's really an honor for me to be here. The post-World War II world, yeah, it wasn't all Leave It to Beaver, right? Where, obviously, you know, there were a variety of right-wing, far-right, sometimes conspiracy theory, and even more, and even more explicitly racist, violent, and anti-Semitic groups. And so one of the things I think to emphasize is that there was a real spectrum. There were movements obviously like McCarthyism, which was conspiratorial. There was, of course, in the 1950s and 60s, the KKK. But one thing I've realized in reading this dissertation by Robert Billups, who's now at UVA, is that there were actually a surprising number of fascist Nazi groups operating, even in 1958, 59, and 60, within the United States, but with a kind of global consciousness because they had connected with others around the world. And what were they doing? They were bombing synagogues. They were defacing Jewish institutions, and so it was really a range. And as Steve Ross and others have said to me, the John Birch Society, which I write about, and we can talk about them and their ideas, the more Nazi-esque parties, the KKK, often saw the Birchers as a little bit to their left. And, but again, I think what I would emphasize is that there's a real a fluidity to these movements, because the Birchers, for example, which were basically isolationist, conspiratorial, a more violent, anti-establishment mode of politics, they often served as a kind of gateway radical group. And so members would sometimes join and then either get radicalized by them even more so, or realize I want something even more explicitly anti-Semitic, more violent, and they would move on. So people like Willis Carto or Robert Depew, who founded the Minutemen. And so, again, it's not like these groups are just contained in their little bubbles. They actually move back and forth often.
You want to add?
Yeah, well, there were several factors that made it possible for such groups to emerge after the war. First of all, the war itself basically temporarily destroyed those groups, because all the pro-Nazi stuff, obviously once Pearl Harbor took place, these groups, but they didn't disappear. They just, in effect, went quiet and silent. But after the war, the factors, a big factor that tended to unite many of these diverse groups was anti-communism, because the alliance with the Soviet Union during the war opened up a whole area of conspiratorial thinking once the war was over, and really became sort of the focal point from which a lot of other things spread for many of these groups who saw conspiracies. And it's interesting because originally they went after the Democrats alone. After all, many of the isolationists before the war were Republicans, and these are folks who it seemed like they would lay off, but then when Eisenhower was elected, they went after him as well. So after a while, it wasn't only targeting Democrats, it was targeting. And then the third element that became a factor in all this was the emergence of the civil rights movement, which of course particularly obviously for the KKK, but not limited to the KKK, for those who saw America as losing its way through the idea of working for civil rights. That too, together with anti-communism, opened up a path, which again was reflected in different ways. And of course we can get to the issue of anti-Semitism and which groups were more involved in it, which not, and I could talk about ADL's work to try to counter it, but I think that was different layers that appeared, which enabled groups that had been quiet for the years during the war to fully emerge. And last point I would make is they were working in a very fertile environment, because public opinion polls about Jews were quite bad in those years after the war. Questions about would you like to work or live near a Jew, and amazing stuff compared to what we even today, when we have some issues. What was going on then meant that a lot of folks were open to some of these things.
And if I would just add, it's really right 1964-65 that the United States becomes a multiracial democracy. Mm-hmm. And so that push toward a multiracial democracy, I think it does provoke a variety of, I don't know if backlashes is the right word, but it certainly radicalizes even more so and creates more space for any number of these groups. And of course the Birchers, the leader, Robert Welch's most infamous conspiracy theory was, of course, that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent. And as one ADL operative said, with a lot of these conspiracy theories, it's not too long before they add the usual Jewish fillip to it, right? Meaning that you don't have to travel very far before they start blaming the Jews.
The one other thing I'd like to add in the broad discussion is that it was written somewhere that when fascism comes to America, it's going to be wrapped around an American flag. And I think that's an important element, that when we start talking about fascism's manifestations in this country, and how it may be very different than what appeared in Europe. And I mean, there are many other factors that are different as well, but I think that particular point was really very relevant. So.
And yeah, I mean, they called themselves Americanists.
Right.
And
super patriots.
Yeah, they were.
So to follow up on some of the more, you mentioned some of the conspiracy theories, but what are some of the more, I'd say, out there views that we see today in hindsight from the John Birch Society and some of these others?
Well, they had a number of out there views. They were very opposed to the multilateral alliances, so get the U.S. out of the United Nations. They started the Impeach Earl Warren campaign. They had a number of conspiracy theories that were operational in the sense that they fought against, the Birchers did in the 60s and beyond, against putting fluoride in your drinking water. And actually, Ginny Thomas's parents, Clarence Thomas's wife, her parents, who probably were Birchers, although I'm not 100% sure, they actually took part, apparently, in Omaha, Nebraska, in this anti-fluoride campaign. And there was, I think, a more explicit racism. The Birchers argued that the civil rights movement was a communist plot, and they would, go around the country, these spokespeople, and the question would be, is the civil rights movement directed by the Kremlin? And it's a bit reminiscent of a kind of birtherism, right? This idea that this organic movement for civil rights, for equal justice within the United States, was actually a foreign plot. And so those are just a few, I don't know, a taste of some of their ideas. But last thing I'll say is, a lot of members ran for school board, or they tried to get Americanist pro-patriotic texts put into their local libraries. So they operated on the local level. And as one of the earlier panelists was talking about, they really tried to, in a sense, I would say, take over civil aspects of civil society at the local level. and kind of remake it in their image in defense of what they define as a kind of Christian, pro-patriot moral order.
Yeah, I would just want to add some context. You know, before the war, as it was described just earlier, and maybe in other sessions as well today, isolationism was the mainstream American attitude. The vast majority of Americans wanted. Those political leaders who were most involved in the isolationist movement, the America First movement, were largely Republicans before the war. After the war, what I call a quirk of history took place. Our enemy was no longer the right-wing extremist Nazis, but the left-wing extremist communists. And that was a key factor in getting many of the isolationist Republicans that had long opposed American intervention in the world to support what became known as the bipartisan American foreign policy, which led to American leadership in the world. For those who were more on the extreme right, however, that very leadership in the world was subject to conspiratorial thinking. Why are we abandoning the isolationism which has been so good to America? It's because the White House is in cahoots with the Soviet Union, and probably connected to all of it are the Jews. And these kinds of thinking, but it was really the fundamental change in American foreign policy that opened up the possibilities of such conspiracy theories. Because now America was not just protecting its own shores, if the conflict, America was truly the main player on the international scene as the Cold War evolved. And that became such fertile ground for conspiratorial thinking to many of these groups, of course, at the same time, anti-communism. It wasn't a contradiction for them that they were anti-communists. You would think, well, they might support it, but in fact, they were saying that communism had infiltrated the White House.
That's right. And I would just briefly add, too, that Birchers, but others, saw the greatest threat, not as Kennedy did, which was communism overseas. They saw it as within. They saw it as within the federal government, within the major institutions of American life, including the media. And if that's the worldview, then it flows logically that you don't want your federal government, communist dominated, involved in places like the UN, which are run by these socialists, that are creating this kind of global order, right? Or this global communist order. And the Birchers actually kept these scoreboards or charts where they would estimate 60%, 70% how each country was dominated by communism. Now, you know, of course, it's very hard to ascribe a percentage, but they did it to give you a sense of just how great they saw it was the internal menace to the United States, the communists. The enemy was within. And from that flowed a lot of their, I think, ideas, rhetoric, and actions.
So how do Jewish groups start to respond to this? Because it doesn't go unchecked, right?
Yeah, well, can I briefly, you want to go?
Yeah, well, for ADL, and it was actually even before I got to ADL, which is hard for some of my colleagues to recognize there ever was a time before. But ADL took, first of all, in the 30s, and Steve Ross has written about this, I think he probably talked about it in his earlier comments about Hitler in Los Angeles, that ADL took its responsibility to try to prevent Nazi violence against Jews and others in California in the 1930s. And we actually had folks who worked for ADL or formerly worked for ADL who infiltrated Nazi groups in California to try to warn about violence and to that. After the war, in a different way, ADL felt that with the Birch Society, but also with some of the even more extreme anti-Semitic groups, that part of our task was to provide inside information to law enforcement and the public about these hate and extremist groups. And so we had sometimes as many as 25 or 30 folks, mostly, by the way, who were not Jewish, who volunteered to attend meetings of the Ku Klux Klan or the Christian Crusade or any of these extremist groups, including the John Birch that you've written about extensively. And that was really to provide then would provide information to the public and to law enforcement about what was really going on in this group. And this was predicated on the idea, an organization like ADL, and others in the Jewish community, we were firm believers in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the right of free speech. And even hateful speech is protected by the First Amendment. So how do you operate against this vile kind of stuff when you believe in the First Amendment? And so the idea was, and Justice Brandeis said it, is the best way to fight it is expose it to the light of day. That's the best way to fight hate. And so we developed these programs that tried to infiltrate, tried to provide information, and then to expose the American public to that kind of hate. Now, we can talk about it later, but in today's world, with the internet and social media, it's a far more complicated subject. But in those days, because you had targeted groups and you could provide specific information, that methodology was really very productive in weakening many of these extremist groups.
Yeah. Well, and I would add, so I have a whole chapter on really the ADL's efforts to not just infiltrate, but expose and discredit the John Birch Society as a hate group, as an extremist group operating outside the bounds of normal American democracy. Meyer Steinbrink, I think is his name, who was a ADL national chair in 1952, said, basically, we need, quote, ammunition for the war to make our land a more perfect democracy. And to me, that quote encapsulates much of the kind of animating spirit. This idea that, A, it's a war, right? The World War II showed, the Holocaust showed, not just to the ADL, but I think other Americans, many other Jewish Americans too, that, hate is something that cannot be, people have a right to free speech, but it cannot, you have to check it. You have to expose it. And that, it's a kind of war. Well, how do you find the ammunition to fight that war? Well, all kinds of means, right? You attend a public lecture, for example. But the ADL, right, as you said, they had code names, they had operatives, and they were very effective. And actually, one of the people, and I don't know if you ever met him or heard of him, but a man named Isidore Zak.
I knew him well.
You knew him well, okay, yeah.
Knew him well.
I had never heard of him, but he just seems like an incredible person. And I do write about him a little bit. He was actually in World War II, he's Jewish, and he was the head of a counter-subversive army unit based out of Boston during World War II. And his job was to lead his team in hunting down fascist spies, communists, saboteurs, and he won a number of commendations. And was and then in '47, he went to work for the ADL, and he helped, I think, in the New England region, operate a program where they were infiltrating the Birch Society. They would take the information that they gleaned and produce their own reports, but they were also working often very closely with members of the media. They supplied information to the FBI, which is one difference between, I think, the Steve Ross's 1930s example, and now what the FBI did with it, I guess, is another story, and Hoover, I'm sure, was still an anti-Semite in the 60s, but they were working with the FBI, and the FBI would actually come to the ADL at times and say, we've heard that some Birch member is giving these horrible speeches about how the bodies of these supposedly dead Jews in the Holocaust, they actually, these were US Army soldiers actually killed by communists. They weren't actually Jews. And so this Birch, so can you investigate that? And so in the ADL would do that. I would also say that a couple other things. One, the mentality was this axiom. They understood this axiom that things can always get worse. And I think that was a powerful kind of guiding principle. And they understood as well that a lot of these groups that they were trying to expose, and I'm not just talking about the ADL here, but other groups even further to the right, that they were pretty secretive, right? That they were not operating, they were operating in the shadows. They were not necessarily playing by the most fair means. You know, they would call and harass people on the phone. We can talk about what the Birchers did. But that needed to be exposed so that people understood what their tactics were, what the far right was up to, how they were anti-democratic, and the hate that was bubbling up from below and above.
So let me give another example, the question you asked about how Jewish groups did. And this involved not only the Jewish community, but the African American community. And that had to do with the fact as the civil rights movement was just beginning to emerge in the early 50s, the KKK grew rapidly and engaged in some of the worst violence in the South, mostly against African Americans, but also Jews and Catholics and others. ADL, we had an office in Georgia, in Atlanta, and ADL, as I said, believed very firmly in the First Amendment, meaning that we couldn't oppose the right of the Klan to march. But the ADL pushed a law that was passed by the Georgia state legislature, which said the Klan, as hateful as it is, has a right to march, but it doesn't have a right to march anonymously. And this became known as the anti-mask law, which ADL proposed and was passed. And the anti-mask law basically said, you can march, but you can't wear those hoods over your head, you know, those terrifying images of the Klan with the hoods and the torches. And so when this was passed, suddenly the Klan could not do exactly what they did before. And this played a very important role in two aspects. One, it helped to diminish the Klan, because suddenly these terrifying figures turned out to be your next-door neighbors. And they were just people. They were haters, but they were just people. So the aura, the traumatic aura of the Klan was weakened. But for ADL, that said something that long-term really became the basic point of our work against extremists of all kinds for decades. And that was our job is literally and figuratively to expose to the American people who these haters are and what they're about, and to count on the goodwill of the American people, the government, and all, to make sure that those folks do not become mainstream or acceptable to them. And so that was a methodology that then became part and parcel. I could talk forever about the many, many examples of, and our Center of Extremism today, which has become a huge operation, still works on that basic premise, even though with social media it's a lot more complicated.
And could I just add really quickly, I think that's a really powerful point. I argue in my book that it was extremely effective. And now it wasn't just the ADL, of course, because of course no one group could do it in isolation. Earlier panels have talked about the politics of solidarity, heard the word ecumenicalism or ecumenical. It was the ADL, but it was also the NAACP, Americans for Democratic Action, the union-backed Group Research Incorporated, elected officials in both parties, by the way, both political parties, the mass media, which was, of course, nothing like it is today. And I wouldn't say it was easy, but it certainly was easier in the 50s and 60s to mount this kind of campaign of exposure. And one of the interesting things about these archives here is that it not just was about what the ADL did and how they achieved what they did, but it was also a window, in a way, to the elements of hate within the Birch Society that the Birch Society was insistent did not exist. Because the ADL was able to uncover, to unearth this kind of, whether it was anti-Semitism, whether it was anti-black racism, where it was this very aggressive, threatening and menacing approach that the Birchers were undertaking within their communities. And so you can see, if you go through these papers, hate from the Birchers in a way leaking from both below and above. Now, I'm not saying all Birchers were haters, or were racist or anti-Semites. I don't think that's the case. But you can certainly see it documented in there. And that's why it's not just such a valuable collection, but you can see how the exposure was very powerful at the time, and why the ADL was so concerned about what the media was reporting about the Birchers.
And at this point in time, they're much more prolific than I think we really realize today. I mean, and they're also not just in the South. I think there's this idea that a lot of this racism and anti-Semitism is coming from the South, but like, where are the hubs of the Birchers?
Well, so it's a really interesting question. One of the things, and I did not anticipate this at all, but the Birchers were, they were very powerful in California, and, most people would say, okay, it's a Sun Belt, right? It's Arizona, it's California. Well, it turns out, and this is, again, in part because of these papers here, these papers are just about New England. And what you see is that there are, Birchers all over New England. They're all over Boston. They are, sure, they're in the South, but they're all over the Midwest. In fact, the Midwest, places like Milwaukee suburbs or Wisconsin, are real hubs of what I would describe as far-right activism and activity. And you can see that in kind of the documents. The Mountain West, right? Places like Montana. So I'm not saying that there were a majority. Clearly they were not. And I think that the Birchers and their ilk, like in their maybe allies, remained on the far right. They really remained extremists for the most part. And actually the Birch movement kind of faded by the 1970s. But it really was a national movement. And, we do see the kind of almost organic nature of the far right, and that it's not regional, not confined simply to, this white South that is pushing back against integration.
I would just add that the greatest failure during this period, of course, was McCarthyism. McCarthy was able to cause such great damage for a number of years, and obviously not on the margins of society, very much in the mainstream of society, and created an atmosphere that was intimidating, and it was really, it had respectability in circles that it should not have had. And so I can say, because Eisenhower, when he was president, ended up giving a speech at ADL in I think it was 54, and which was the first time that he hinted that there's criticism coming towards McCarthy and McCarthyism. And he was allowed to do what he did without major opposition for several years, and this was a real failure, and it caused great damage. And the point I'm making is that this was an element that was very similar to many of these radical right groups with its anti-communism, its conspiracy theories, but this was in the halls of Congress and before the mainstream of the American people, even with all that the Birch Society and others achieved certain things, they never truly got into the mainstream of American society.
Very briefly, and then the big worry, of course, the fear in '64 when Goldwater ran, is that basically we have this was the argument of some liberals, that there was a kind of homegrown fascist movement within the United States that is on the verge of taking over one of the political parties, a major element of it, and that's why, Nelson Rockefeller, he gave that famous speech in '64 at the convention where he says, we have to reject extremism within the Republican Party, these haters, the people doing the bombings, and then he's basically booed down. So there was real fears, and actually, last thing I'll say is there was a robust debate about the Birchers. Who were they, right? Yes, sure, they're American citizens, But were they fascists or were they pathetic, right? As one said, were they little old ladies in tennis shoes to be mocked? Or were they like really a fascist threat, brown shirts, silver shirts, as they were called? And that was kind of a robust debate among liberals at the time.
Yeah, speaking to that, there's the question of the subject is fascism in America. Is it real? Did it ever move in a way? And when you think about fascism in Europe before World War II, it had legitimacy all across Europe. It was not something that was viewed as outside legitimate discussion. And so in so many countries, and fascism, I think this Professor Paxton has written about it, there are three basic steps. First is the ideology. The radical right, the things that were talked about, the violence, the propaganda, the scapegoating, all those things is the thing. But the second element of it is, does it become part of the political mainstream? And in America, to a large extent, that has truly never happened, thank God. Even with some of the threats and even with the McCarthyism, I wouldn't say that fascism is a political. And of course, the third level of it is taking power, which it did in a number of European countries before the war, and basically after the war was still in Spain, still had a fascist government. But in America, it had never achieved that, and so I think we at least have to make that distinction when we're talking about fascism, that it operates on some levels, but it never ever reached a level where political power was a reality. So.
And just to be clear, I actually don't refer to Birchers as fascists. I mean, I don't think it's for me, it wasn't a very useful analytical lens. There were, though, actual fascist neo-Nazi movements like the swastika epidemic in the U.S. So, and the National States Rights Party and the American Nazi Party in Rockwell. So, I think it's important to kind of draw that distinction. And as the first panel said, I mean, Hitler was popular, right? He was very popular among many Germans, and that was not the case in post-World War II America.
Which gets to another subject. Maybe I'm preempting a question that you have, but that has to do with the issue of Holocaust denial. Now, Holocaust denial there were already signs of it shortly after the war, but it really began to emerge. I always remember, because I was working at ADL as a junior staffer, and I ended up reviewing the book by Arthur Butts, who's a professor of engineering at Northwestern University, who wrote a huge tome on trying to prove that the Holocaust never happened. And what always struck me as Holocaust denial, which today is very much alive in certain circles, the main political purpose of aside from the obvious anti-Semitism to deny the obvious, and again, I'm thinking of it now, by the way, if you will, in passing, because I heard people interviewed the last few days who basically denied what took place in Israel last week, who simply said, I've heard people, oh, this is just propaganda, it's not verified. And I'm thinking to myself, these are like the Holocaust deniers. You have all the evidence in the world, including, by the way, the videos of Hamas itself, and they're denying it. That's, of course, what Holocaust is. But the political purpose of Holocaust denial, in my view, is to resuscitate the legitimacy of fascism. Because with the murder of 6 million Jews, fascism no longer was acceptable. Even if the world didn't do enough about anti-Semitism afterwards, the idea that fascism could ever regain its former level of legitimacy was out the window with the murder. And so that, to me, is the underlying political purpose. If you can raise questions about whether the Holocaust ever happened, that opens a path for fascists to reemerge into the mainstream of society. So it's just something that I think about a lot as I hear, and as I saw some of those folks being interviewed in some of these demonstrations yesterday about the horror that took place in Israel, and it was just so reminiscent of the Holocaust deniers.
Speechless.
I could keep going. You want to talk conspiracy? I mean, well,
I think it's an important topic. I think it makes sense.
Well, one, I think when I mentioned the FBI asking the ADL to look into this Holocaust denialist within the Birch Society, saying the bones at Buchenwald were bones of American soldiers killed by communists, I think that's one motivation, right? That they were concerned about, what kind of proto-fascist movement or ideology within the United States. But more broadly, on conspiracy theories, and these conspiracy theories that I write about, that others have written about, they're not all about, of course, the Jews are not always the behind it, but they often are in these conspiracy theories. And there is a way in which I think it serves another important purpose for the people propagating them, which is to dehumanize, right? It's really the dehumanization, because here are these people who are committing these monstrous crimes, right? They're stealing your wealth. They're destroying the country. I mean, that's the sort of language. And they're doing it from positions of power. And so, for example, when Kennedy was killed, one of the things I try to chronicle in the book is, at first, the Birchers are very worried that it was a segregationist or a Birch member that had killed Kennedy. And then when it turns out it's Lee Harvey Oswald, the Birchers are basically all over that. And they say, we were right all along. But there's some of these Birch leaders, they weave these different conspiracy theories about what happened. So they're not even on the same page. One person, who's actually a raging anti-Semite, Revillo Oliver, he's talking about how the federal government was rehearsing Kennedy's funeral a week before Kennedy was assassinated. And even some Birchers actually revolted in horror. They said, this guy is insane, and our reputation is going to be ruined in Tucson, Arizona for the next decade because of the insanity. So I'm kind of going on and digressing, but the point, I think, is that the kind of conspiracy theories that you're talking about, that the Holocaust didn't really happen, it was totally made up, I think it's very easy for those to lead to very dangerous places that dehumanize the object of the conspiracy and that create a permission structure for people to take even more radical and actually sometimes violent actions.
I would just add that in many ways I think of the history of anti-Semitism as the history of one big conspiracy theory.
Of course.
I always point out that the intellectual moment of anti-Semitism, the height intellectually, not politically or on the ground, is the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, the infamous forgery document that came out of the Russian czarists in the early. This really summed up, which basically, it wasn't merely what the document, which is absurd, I've written about it, it's an absurd document. It talks in 23 chapters how the Jewish leaders around the world are secretly planning to take over the world. The fact that they did that was in itself one thing, but the really important point about it, related to what we're talking about, is that millions and millions of people around the world believed it. And they believed it because they said, it's only confirming what we have known all along. And now on paper, it shows the evidence of what we knew all along, with the Jews are all powerful, poisonous, and that. And therefore, with that kind of thinking, it just basically means that any time there's a social, political, economic crisis in society, and we saw this, for example, during the COVID things, people will seize upon it and basically say it's the Jews' fault. They're the ones who do it, because there's that whole history and basically this intellectual idea that the Jews are not like you and me, that the real truth about the Jew is something hidden, something poisonous, something all-powerful. And therefore, whenever there's a crisis in society, you can be sure that some folks, without overstating it, will look to a conspiracy theory about how the Jews are to blame for it. So.
Can I just add one? So we were talking about how, these groups, Birchers, others were on the fringe, and it's true, and they remain there mostly. But I do think it's important to add that a lot of the people who were floating these conspiracy theories, who were floating hate, who were leading this movement and in the movement, were in many respects white, wealthy, privileged. They were industrialists. They were upper middle class, doctors, dentists. There's a guy named, just an example, James Oviatt, whose name still graces this incredible building in downtown Los Angeles. And he was the city's leading haberdasher. And he started sending, I think, thousands of copies of Common Sense, which was basically a rehash of the learned Elder Design, to his customers. Well, the ADL in the West Coast got wind of this, and they wrote a letter to this guy, Oviatt, and they said, if you keep, and he had a birch sign in his office, and he rented out his space, I think, to the Christian Defense League, which was like a Gerald L.K. Smith offshoot, like very racist, quite violent. And they said, if you don't stop, sending out this anti-Semitic tract to thousands of people, we're going to expose you. And Oviatt was very defensive. ADL exposed him, and then Oviatt sued the ADL. And what's interesting, though, is that in the lawsuit, Oviatt says, look, I'm not anti-Semitic. I even have some Jews who work for me. But in the lawsuit, of course, he reveals his anti-Semitism because he starts talking about the Jewish media and this conspiracy of Jews against him. I mean, it's like, you couldn't have scripted it that way, but it sort of makes the case that the ADL was making. He made it himself. But he was, of course, very wealthy, quite prominent, and these people were not sort of, blathering on the margins of American society. They were people like Fred Koch, for example, or Robert Welch, a former candy manufacturer. They were white, wealthy, but yet they saw the country slipping away from them. And so that was kind of the paradox of this movement. The most powerful, in some ways, wealthiest people in the country viewed the country that had provided them in a way so much as really being destroyed from within.
And that's something we can kind of see today, just to bring it back to the present, this idea that something is going to be taken away from you if somebody else has something. So last question before we get to some of the audience questions. What do you think is the biggest threat to American Jews today?
When you ask that question at this particular moment, it's, listen, I've worked for ADL, as was said, for over 50 years. I spent so much of that time defending and explaining Israel, and I never felt so sad as I feel now. And this was by far the worst thing that has happened to Israel, in my view, in its history. And of course, it's been pointed out repeatedly, the largest number of Jews being murdered in one day since the Holocaust. But I just think that on top of that, the level of reaction by some who, in other words, you disagree with Israel, you even criticize Israel. I have no problem, you could talk about it all the time. But when something like this happens where men, women, and children are murdered in the most brutal fashion, there's no second opinion that should be there. There should be no rationalization. And the very idea that folks at this worst moment, really since the Holocaust, the worst moment for the Jewish people, would go out and demonstrate against Israel is really, to me, a new level of concern that we have, and we are trying on many levels to deal with it. We're also trying to monitor all of the things and expose it. And look, and then you add that to the rising number of anti-Semitic incidents that we have described in our annual audit, and the level of social media is coming from both the right and the left. And understand, and if anyone suggests to you that anti-Semitism has an ideological monopoly, you should really ignore them, because anti-Semitism can come from the right, it can come from the left, it can come from majority communities, and it can come from minority communities. Not to say that it's all the same, you have to study each manifestation of it, But the ideology of anti-Semitism has no monopoly. And I think we, at a very partisan time, it's unfortunate that people, when I hear someone saying to me, the only problem is the far right, the white supremacists who are anti-Semitic, I basically ignore them. If I hear others say the only people are those left-wing anti-Israel people who hate Jews, I also ignore them. If you politicize it, you're undermining the effort to counter it. And the other point I would just add in conclusion about it is, I think the most important challenge for those of us who are trying to counter anti-Semitism and to prevent it from really growing in this country is to strengthen the political center. It's the weakening of the political center which really, I think, gives opportunity both on the right and the left for anti-Semites. And the political center doesn't mean everybody agrees. What it does mean is a certain level of civility, a certain level that we have to work together to compromise and all of those things. So to me, that is, in the broadest sense, aside from the direct response to anti-Semitism, I think that's the biggest challenge.
Do you want to go ahead and answer that one too?
No, I thought that was great, other than, I share all these concerns.
Okay, so we have, every single one of these questions is good, and I wish we had time for 14 questions, because that's how many we have here. So I'm going to kind of see how many we get through. Do we know how the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, QAnon, etc., proceeded from the Birchers and McCarthyism? How are they the same, and how are they different?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Look, I would say there are a lot of differences, and I do not want to say, these are just the Birchers 2.0. It's not that at all. But there are some ties. I mean, I think that what I argue in my book, at least, is that the Birchers helped to create, they're not the only ones, but they helped to create a kind of alternative political tradition, or they helped forge it in modern America on the far right. And again, it includes conspiracy theories, all the other things I mentioned. And that tradition, even though the Birchers by the mid-70s they still exist, but they're weak. But that tradition is picked up on by a variety of successors. Ideological successors, sometimes political successors. And whether or not, the leaders of the Oath Keepers or QAnon know anything about the Birch Society, I do think that there's a kind of ideological inheritance that they have picked up from them. And some of the theories, or some of the books that they read, for example, so Alex Jones, who apparently his dad was a member of the Birch Society, and Jones has said that, of course, people are like, yeah, of course, he said that the most important book for him, I think, was John Stromer's None Dare Call It Treason, which was a huge bestseller, but also a big book for the Birchers, right? This conspiratorial. And you see that a lot. I mean, Nick Fuentes, the white supremacist, he said in an interview within the past year, he said, we're kind of like my movement, the Groypers, we're kind of like the Birch Society, but like the modern day Birchers. And Steve Bannon actually held up a copy of my book on his show when he was interviewing the co-founder of Moms for Liberty. And he said, it was kind of shocking. He said, this book is incredible. He said, the book is totally anti-MAGA, patriot-hating, Trump-hating, but I really like it. It's got a real detailed analysis. Now, why? He didn't really say, but he's interviewing the co-founder of Moms for Liberty. I think he found maybe it's a blueprint in there. Maybe, though, it's this idea of challenging the establishment, which the Birchers did. They hated the establishment. And he asked the Moms for Liberty co-founder, you like the Birchers? She's like, no, of course not. We're our own unique movement. She said, do we share some of the Birchers' values or their ideas? Of course, But so she kind of, I do think that, again, it's not like they're not like studying the Birchers, but I do think there is a way in which these ideas are circulated into the bloodstream and they get passed around. And there are other influences too, of course, as well.
I agree with what you were saying. I think one of the clear differences, of course, was the Birchers so focused on anti-communism because it was a different time. Those were the time, the height of the Cold War. That doesn't mean that you don't have some of that in these groups as well, but it sort of doesn't have that kind of appeal with the Cold War over and the fall of the Soviet Union. Plus, China comes into it, and that's a vehicle to do that. But I think so much of the thinking is very similar.
Yeah, and even though communism isn't, although sometimes you do hear communists referred to today as an enemy, the theories feel very similar about kind of the New World Order, this international plot. The enemy maybe has morphed, the kind of liberal left or the woke left. I mean, the terminology is different. But the way it's kind of put together and this sense that these are fundamentally un-American, these are foreign ideas that are being imported in and destroying the country, and that the greatest threat is within. But yes, that's clearly, communism is
and it's the interesting thing is that we haven't seen major manifestations of anti-Semitism in some of these groups yet, but I would say that because of the fundamental conspiratorial thinking that they reflect, I would not be surprised that we'll see more of it as we go forward. So.
Yeah. Well, I felt like I've seen a fair bit, more than I would care to in the past 5 years, but yes, not as much as,
What is the status of the John Birch Society? Is it still in existence?
Yeah, it still exists. They moved their headquarters a number of years ago from Belmont, Massachusetts to Appleton, Wisconsin, the home of Joe McCarthy. It does still exist, and one of the things I document in the book is sort of the Birchers' afterlife, kind of post-75, and they do keep popping up, whether it's like Birch members or the Birch move. So just for example, like Sarah Palin, when she was selected as McCain's vice presidential nominee, there was a picture that surfaced of her in her office of the city council of Wasilla with the magazine, with the Birch Society magazine in front of her. Now, it's like that kind of, it still circulates. The Birchers themselves, though, have been eclipsed. So even though they still exist, they still attend, let's say they have a booth at CPAC, but they've been eclipsed by, groups like the Tea Party, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, any other, Bannon, and QAnon. And so it's really in the 60s, it really was, Welch, for politically minded Americans, the founder, Robert Welch, was basically a household name. And Welch once joked that he said to an audience, well, you would expect to see my horns. I've come here, you think I'm the devil, right? Because that's how I've been portrayed. But I'm sorry to disappoint you. And, the Birchers were seen, people knew who they were. It was a major threat, a major worry in the eyes of many, and that has faded. But I argue that they did help bequeath with other groups a legacy that continues and is in some ways thriving today in a way that it did not decades ago.
This is a totally different line of question. Was the Jewish Defense League fascist?
Well, first of all, we at ADL, very often people would call up and say, is this the Jewish Defense League? Because it was JDL and ADL, so we used to get confused all the time. We actually issued the first major report critical of the Jewish Defense League and the Jewish community because there was a bit of a tendency to say we can't air our dirty linen and laundry in public, that kind of thing. But we recognized that it was a very problematic group. It surely had anti-democratic tendencies, whether we use the word fascist. And in fact, when Meir Kahane went to Israel to live, he was banned by the Israelis from participating in the political system. So the fact is, whether you call it fascist or not, it may be a technical term, but it surely was anti-democratic, had a philosophy that had a violent side. And I always used to say, I come from the Orthodox world, so I used to sometimes meet people, and there's no doubt that Mayor Kahana did some good work on the Soviet Jewry issue, and that was attractive to some people. But I used to say when I was concerned about it, trying to convince people that they should not be supporting Kahana, I would say, forget about the people who he hates and he would discriminate against. He would do it to you if he were in power, meaning that he fundamentally was anti-democratic, and I think Israel recognized that, and that's why they kept him out. So I don't know whether fascist is the right word, but it surely was an anti-democratic leader.
Yeah, and I would just add that actually Mayor Kahane went by an alias, Michael King, and was a member of the Birch Society for a time. And at some point, I think in the 70s, when, I don't know if it was before or after, because he was convicted, I think, on charges of bomb making
well, there was
and they asked, and the Birch Society confirmed it. Yeah, under the alias Michael King, he used to be a bircher, and there were a handful of African American birchers, or a handful of Jewish birchers, something called the Jewish Society, I think, for Americanists. But there were a fringe minority group within the birchers.
In your opinions, how disturbing are the sort of book banning and other things that we might consider precursors to fascism that we see today? I told you, they're really good questions.
Yeah. And the universe of things to worry about, where does it fall?
Yeah. Look, we have a bunch of trends in this country that are disturbing, and sometimes the implication of these questions is that all these problems are only coming from the far right, but I would argue that many of the problems that we have, that the left, which talks about itself as sort of liberal, but they're really illiberal kind of activities, and the framing of it as if it's something right. So I think I think it goes back to my earlier point. I think the weakening of the center in this country is really one of the biggest challenges, and that allows some of these manifestations to take place. And if we're going to reestablish a more civil society, I think people have to be willing to start to stand up and say, whether I agree with you or not, we have to find a way to work together. And so
I would add that one interesting aspect, or two maybe interesting aspects from the 60s at least, and the example of the Birch Society, was that a containment, right, strategies of containment, they work. Now, it's harder today for all sorts of reasons, but they were effective. Those alliances, those kind of cross-racial, cross-religious, interdenominational alliances were very effective. Often, of the kind centrist sort of politics or liberal politics from the 60s. And then the other thing that I argue is that in the example of the Birch Society, at least, they kind of burned themselves out. And this gets to the question of, well, today, what happened to them? One of the things I argue is that over time, they started out pretty radical, but they got more and more radical. Its members became more and more disruptive. Some became more violent. It drew more and more bigots to its ranks. And I don't know if it's quite an iron law of extremist movements, but it could be that some of these movements become more extremist over time. Because once you unleash, I think, an extremist ideology or conspiracy theories, you attract, I think, even more extreme members. And so, the Birchers, I think, kind of self-combusted. Now, I'm not saying, whether we're talking about far right or far left, that is going to happen. But I do think that there are at least some Americans in this country still, probably a majority, although that's, I guess, debatable, but who are not in tune with what they feel is extremist politics, and they shun that. And I do think that we have seen examples over the past decade of civil society rising up in a way, and I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, but in which we have seen these alliances and civil society attempting to resist or to speak up and to try to expose, again, through democratic means, through good speech, some of these more hateful elements.
I would just add that, of course, the factor that is fundamentally different today is social media, which we really haven't focused on. So, for example, I've been talking earlier on about ADL's support for the First Amendment and free speech, and we still strongly believe that, but the methodology of fighting hate in the context of a free speech environment is very different today than it was then. So, for example, we have a full-time operation in Silicon Valley dealing with the major social media and internet companies, dealing with the issue of hate on the internet, we've been doing it for years with them. We decided about 2 years ago, because we had approached Facebook so many times for them to follow their own rules of the road when it came to hate, that they weren't doing it. So we decided to launch a 1-month pause on advertising on Facebook. So the kind of thing that we would not have done in a previous free speech environment. But we decided to do it, and we thought we might get a little support. We got over 1,000 institutions and organizations who joined us in this 1-month pause of not advertising on Facebook for 1 month. And the point is that you have to think of other ways to deal with hate and in the context of free speech, because in the old days, somebody would give a speech and we would be able to say, here's the good stuff that you're not hearing, and we'd ever counter bad speech with good speech. On the internet and social media, that's not possible. People are exposed to all kinds of things that you can't get to them, and you can't really counter it in the same way. So you have to figure out, while still truly advocating for free speech, that we have to find other ways to counter hate that is spreading. And of course, the ability to disseminate it and to provide misinformation adds tremendously to the environment that I was talking about, in which the center is weakened because the most extreme elements are able to get to people that they never could get to before.
So that's our time. Thank you so much. Perfect way to end it, right? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you to Kenneth Jacobson and Dr. Matthew Dallek and all of our panelists today. Thank you so much.